market development, I think we've seen different segments evolve differently. So, there's the two-wheeler story,
Right.
where you've seen, where I think we're still waiting for the major mainstream conventional two-wheeler players to kind of make a big bang in the electric segment. But we've seen players like Ather and
Right.
others kind of come into that space, and I think there has been a fair level of maturity that's evolved, at least on the technology side. What we've lacked probably is we've seen a fair amount of low speed electric two wheelers coming into the market. But if you really want to kind of shift, like in a big way, market transformation, you want to create what I would call as equivalent vehicles to what IC engine users are relatively used to, right? And so for example, I mean, in two wheelers, a good example is I think Honda Activa is one of the
Right.
most popular models in that space. But if you kind of try to compare in terms of something that's equivalent in terms of power, rating, performance, whatever, it's hard to find an electric two wheeler that kind of matches up to that. So I think we've reached what we need in the two-wheeler space is this next phase of a little more in terms of model quality and whatever else to drive the truly conventional two-wheeler buyers into mainstream market. You look at three-wheelers, very similar things, right? You've seen we if you actually look at, for example, the Vahan data that the Ministry of Road Transport puts out regularly, you will find three-wheeler electric share saying it's above 50%, but actually the big part of it is thousands and thousands of e-rickshaws
Right.
that are flooding the market. But if you do a true comparison of the auto to an electric auto, then the market share is only, I think, 6 or 7%, right? And also, I think one of the big difference being that e-rickshaw market is largely lead acid battery driven,
Right.
whereas the truly e-auto market is more lithium ion battery. I mean, having said that, I should say, in more recent times, I used to be a pretty proponent of the fact that e-rickshaws, they were a good interim whatever solution, but there are issues around the quality of the vehicle, safety to passengers, things like that. And just having been in the automotive industry, I will say that there was, I think, this time around 2016, 15, 16, 17, when this ecosystem kind of took off in the three-wheeler space, where it happened in a fairly unregulated manner. So it resulted in this parallel ecosystem and e-rickshaws being created. But I believe that there should be no transition in transportation services or vehicles where it compromises passenger safety or whatever else, right? So,
Right.
or road safety, right? So I think we missed a little bit of that in the rush for electrification. Uh, so in the sense that I think when we talk about vehicle electrification in general, we should still remember that it still operates within the fundamental boundary of what transportation should look like. And so there are these elements of safety and whatnot that you still want to consider and you don't want to give up on. Um, um, so that's on the three-wheeler. And the evolution on four-wheelers, I think in cars, we've seen, I mean, there's no doubt there has been significant ramp up now with, at least the major players. So Tatas and Mahindras and everyone kind of coming in with more and more models, especially in the last, I think, 2.5 years, we've seen a lot more activity. But I think one of the issues there still is we've still not been able to crack the price barrier, right? We're still, I mean, your Tata Nexon, which is still the very popular, whatever, electric compact SUV, is still priced at anywhere between, 13, 14 lakhs going up to 18, 19. Similarly, the XUV 400 electric from Mahindra. The Tata Tiago is the new, low end, or rather the lower end entry vehicle model, but still costs 8, 9 lakhs. As compared to its own gasoline variant, which is a couple of lakhs cheaper. So I think, but it's a good start, right? So we need to see more of the Tiago type market evolve, where I think there can be a lot of good competition. Um, but I but there has so I think if you look at what's kind of led to a lot of this is there is no doubt, the general push from government policy in terms of, whether it's the FAME scheme or there was if you go back, there was the phase manufacturing program, which has now evolved into PLI and all of that stuff. But I think that but it's been a slow evolution, right? We could have gone faster. We could have seen a lot more happen. I think now we're coming on 8 years of, fairly comprehensive EV policy starting going back from 2015. So it's not like we don't know what we need to be doing. So I think what has happened is a lot of these policy efforts are happening in isolation. So there's a FAME scheme that's been designed because they want to do incentives, but there is a separate, effort in a different line ministry that's doing, let's say, fuel economy and emission regulation on the IC engine side. But all of them are not kind of aligned with saying, okay, what is the goal that we want to get to, let's say in 2025 or 2030? And then let's work backwards and see how do you make sure that the regulatory efforts that are happening in different line ministries align to meet that goal, right? So everyone's kind of doing everything in isolation. So I think that's kind of led to some level of suboptimal impact of policy. So that would be I guess my 2 cents on how we see the market evolution. But I think on buses, that's a whole different ball game, right? And they've done a good job. But I mean, I think that's always a good story to tell. But that works in a different ecosystem, right? There is an opportunity there to actually aggregate demand and kind of do what CSL has done or ESL has done over the past few years. So I think there we've definitely been able to learn. I think, in fact, very often in international forums, what India has been able to do on the buses side is definitely something that others can learn from. But I think on some of the other segments, there is stuff that we can learn from other countries. So, like I said, I think it goes back to the point on how we now align policy decisions and I think to that extent, I would now actually think that. So I think if you look at other markets, especially Europe, which is fairly similar to India in terms of at least in terms of the light duty vehicle segment and composition, and also the fact that India does follow European regulations on fuel economy or emissions with the general lag, but we've looked up to Europe more often than other markets. So I think even in Europe, right, they've used their fuel economy regulation as a tool to drive EV adoption, and linked to that has been whatever incentives and everything else, even within EU member countries. So whether you look at France or Germany, they've tweaked the vehicle taxation system to kind of meet or align with that objective of achieving, let's say, 20%, 25% new EV sales by a certain particular year. So there has been, and even in the EU, there are different departments who are managing these regulations, but there has been a more concerted and coordinated effort. I think for India, I think it's not that we don't have these regulations. It's a question of being able to bring the right players together. So Ministry of Road Transport, Department of Heavy Industries, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, at least as 3 key players need to come together and say, okay, what is our aim? How do each of us in our respective roles of policy making kind of figure out what we need to do to move the needle along? So I think that's one. So I think India we need to now be able to not shy away from setting what I would call as enforceable targets or whatever. I mean, we may or may not like the word, but the point is, you need to have something that's a clear thing. I mean, take renewable energy, for example. We've been hammering down over the years now. We started, if you go back to 2010, we said 20 gigawatts by 2020. Today we are talking 450 gigawatts of renewables, and it's a socialized target. Everyone has accepted that this is it, and they're working towards that goal, right? It's a non-negotiable thing. It's happening. Policy is trickling down. States are being asked to do things. I mean, it's gone all the way down from national to subnational. For some reason, we have not been able to do that with the EV ecosystem, right? We've hesitated in being able to take that leap of faith and say, okay, India wants to set a clear, enforceable target, and then work backwards and say, okay, here are the regulations that industry has to comply with. Here are the things that will happen. Incentives will be aligned to that. If you don't comply, if you don't meet sales targets, you kind of miss the bus. Whatever. I mean, there are ways to do it. But I think this is where, for me, is the largest policy gap that we're probably missing to move to that next level of market transformation that we want to see. I actually don't think we lack the capability or the capacity in India. We are now the world's third largest automotive, at least light duty manufacturer, right? And we have a very strong role, not just in the vehicle space, but also in the auto component space in the global value chain. I mean, there is absolutely no reason why I would even for a minute think that we don't have the capability, the capacity to deliver. And if you look at most of the Indian OEMs, they're well integrated in the global ecosystem. We have technology partnerships. We have all of that. I think one of the for me, actually, I wouldn't as much say technology development is a challenge as much as sometimes you just need the stick is missing, right? If there is a clear push and a regulation that requires industry to comply, and I'm just saying, for example, let's say there is a clear target that says India needs to achieve 30% new sales for cars, for example, and then different OEMs based on their whatever market size and share or whatever are given certain just the way we do this for cafe regulations, right? Each OEM gets its fleet target to meet the fuel economy norm. The same way, if we give them their distributed sales targets and shares, which cumulatively add up to that goal in 2030, they would have to do it, right? And they would have to figure out how much money to put in R&D, what needs to be done, and innovate and figure out at what price point they want to play. But also the fact that this clear supply regulation will also give them market certainty. It'll give them demand certainty. I mean, that's business 101, right? You don't do anything till you find commercial sense. I don't think we often see this target setting, etc., as a negative. In my mind, actually, if we take an objective view on this for a minute, then you will actually find that, I mean, especially today, I mean, 5 years ago, maybe, yes, industry pushed back, but look at it today. I mean, almost every OEM is investing in the EV space in some way or the other. But having this clear pipeline only makes it better for them to get a better ROI on their investment and whatever else. So I actually think that for me, that supply side push will actually be the biggest driver of whatever technology advancement and innovation they need to do. But I think and the challenge is not that we don't know how to build an EV powertrain or an EV at this point. It's that we have the basics. It's the question of just going up to that next level of saying, okay, to deliver a quality product in the market. But now, because I have a clear volumes understanding of what this could mean because of all these whatever supply mandates and regulations, then I can start planning and saying, okay, I need to deliver, because there is a guaranteed volume potentially of 100,000 vehicles. I can now figure out and make this not at X, but at X minus 30 or whatever, right, at that cost. And that starts to then create a more competitive environment, and then people figure out stuff, right? I mean, we've already seen this in the ICE space. Take Toyota and Maruti Suzuki. The Maruti Baleno has been a popular vehicle, right? And now Toyota Glanza is basically doing an exact vehicle powertrain share, which is just a rebadged version with some minor edits. But essentially, OEMs have always, when push comes to shove, have always figured out ways to cost optimize and do technology partnerships, right? So there's no reason we can't do this in the EV space. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, and this is the old chicken and egg problem, right? You build the charging first or the vehicles first. But I think the issue is it doesn't take too much time to put up charging infrastructure in terms of having it in the system in play.
Mm.
It's always having enough demand in the market for vehicles that will require charging infrastructure. That's the question. So, but I think in general, I mean, but having said that, we have already, right? We have already started to see, at least in the major metros, you're right. We've started to see some level of public charging infrastructure come up.
Right.
But I think one of the issues is even now, I guess because so one we haven't seen fleets pick up EVs in as much share yet as much as we would like. I mean, there are still players like Blue Smart and others who are doing stuff, and but it's still not a big volumes game. So I guess the demand for public charging infrastructure is still limited, and you'll there is still a level of cautiousness when players are going out to invest and put such ecosystem in play, because it's capital intensive. They're putting it down, and there is no guarantee that they will recover in 4 years or 5 years or 2 years, because there is no market certainty that they're able to hedge on and bet on. So I think there are those issues for infrastructure. But
Right.
having said that, I mean, we for example, now Delhi has this new aggregator policy that has come up, and it's been notified now
Yes.
very recently, which now will puts actually a target and enforces fleets to have a certain share of EVs in their fleet progressively all the way out in the next 5-7 years. Now that is a clear volumes game, right? Now the ecosystem now has a clear signal that this is going to happen. There is no two ways about it. It's enforceable, and any good analyst can do the numbers and say, okay, you can expect so many electric two-wheelers, so many electric three-wheeler cargo, and or whatever, and then so many vans to be in play in the Delhi ecosystem because of this requirement. And so now, how do I figure out, where I can strategically play the charging infrastructure game? And then you'll have charge point operators coming in and setting up infrastructure, and you'll see this sudden growth, right? So this is a good example of how one smart policy can enable not just vehicle demand but also ecosystem development, right? And so you need something like that. But I mean, because on the other hand, you've already got almost all the states, if I'm not mistaken, now the respective electricity regulators have issued charging EV tariffs and everything else, right? So you've already given all those whatever incentives or incentive ecosystem for infrastructure to come up. So I mean, I do think that that's where probably some of the rollout gap is. But and then you also have most of the EV adoption, I guess, is also happening I mean, at least for cars, it's personal use. And it's not necessarily everyone who lives in. I mean, it's largely people who potentially have the opportunity to have a dedicated parking spot where they can set up some charging ecosystem for their own selves. So, and most of these people are still the upper income groups of India. So they probably are doing workplace charging at best and not really relying on other public charging infrastructure.
Right.
So so that's again a deterrent, right, to build out wherever else. But having said that, I must say, my last trip to India recently, I was there a couple of months ago. I saw I mean, when I used to live in Bombay, I've seen like the malls starting to get. But more
Mm.
recently, I've actually seen people drive into the malls and actually plug in their vehicles there. So I guess that's a good sign, right? That
Right.
that people are doing and all of this. So in fact, when I was at Mahindra, we had even tried to partner with malls and hotels and whatever else to create an incentive structure, where, okay, if you come and park and shop for whatever, 300 rupees or 500 rupees, you get 50 rupees off your charging or something like that, right? You
Easy.
get a
Right.
discount. So ways to incentivize people to be confident to come and bring an EV down to wherever and do some of this. So things like that. But then there is, of course, the whole building code stuff that's already come in place, right? We have the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs that's got the new requirement for, I think, 20% of new parking lots in residential places, all new residential construction that requires to be EV compliant, charging compliant, and things like that. So I think enforcing some of that will also proliferate infrastructure to exist and give and kind of give some of the potential EV adopters who are on the margins some confidence that they can access infrastructure. I don't think consumers are very different. I'll say that. End of the day, everyone likes. Yes, relatively in income and social context, maybe some of the fundamental dynamics might differ. Okay, cars are more expensive in the US, but do remember that in countries like the US, they're so car centric that they do sell a lot of cars, but there are equally that many people who buy used vehicles because there is no other way. There is no public transport. There is no other alternative for them to rely on. Whereas in markets like India or Europe, there are car buyers, but then there are people who buy one car, but still, for certain trips use public transport or whatever, right? And that's the thing, right? And so I would just say that, the fundamental consumer who owns a vehicle, I think we can so at least if you were to compare globally, I would compare cars because cars is still a equal comparison. Markets like the US don't really have a two-wheeler market the way we have it in India or even in Europe for that matter. But there is a hesitancy here too. I mean, we've seen in the US, if you see, more than half of the EV sales happen in California, but not because consumers in California are any different. It's because California has a 100% sales mandate for 2035. It has specific sales requirements for each OEM that is selling vehicles to meet certain percentage of their annual sales as EVs. And it's all calculated. There is a whole system and there's a mechanism. It's called the Advanced Clean Cars regulation. Now it's called the version 2 is in effect now, but or taking effect next year. But essentially, what I'm saying is there is a clear regulatory push to make the supply side react. And when they have to do it, they figure out a way to incentivize consumers to buy more EVs, right? And the market picks up. Europe, same thing. For the longest time, Europe had used, for example, France is very well known with what's called the rebate or the bonus malus system, where they basically, they use the fuel economy regulation. They created a threshold. They said any vehicle beyond this threshold emitting so many grams CO2 on a non-linear basis. So as the more you go away from that or on a higher basis, the emission taxation picks up and it goes in an exponential form. So over the vehicle purchase price you're paying, and right now, today in France, you could be paying almost the entire price of the vehicle. So the highest taxation deviation goes up to 35 or 40,000 euros now. So, that's almost another new vehicle. So it's forced OEMs to figure out, that people are not going to, after a certain, people are price sensitive, right? So this is the game. People are price sensitive in every market, whether it's the US, Europe, or India. It's the level of sensitivity price that is slightly different. European consumers are a little similar to India, I would say, more price sensitive than the US. But that's the point, right? They figured out what that sensitivity factor is, and then they tweaked the taxation system. They created an incentive mechanism, on the other hand, saying that, okay, we will support and whatever, but they were able to do that. And they're one of the, leading markets. I wouldn't count Norway as a very good example just because they subsidized their way out of this game, but they had a lot of money, right? They have significant revenues from oil and etc. historically, and they've been able to do that also, but they're a very small volume market. I think if I'm not mistaken, 300,000 vehicles or whatever annually. So it's a much smaller market, right? But I think for India, this is the thing. It's price sensitivity, but I think this is where we have to also think about who we're thinking about as a consumer. So if you're talking about a conventional two-wheeler owner who has never owned a car, remember that a two-wheeler for many people is like the first form of personal mobility that they own. And it's not a car for them. It's for them, that's that. And so sometimes in that context, it's hard for some people to necessarily leapfrog if they're not confident, or they don't understand the technology or whatever, or it doesn't serve many of the needs and purposes for which they use, right? And a lot of these and then for households that move from, let's say, a two-wheeler to a car, or even have a car, I mean, there is a lot of this aspirational element, etc. We can argue that I don't think that's necessarily an excuse, but then the point is that level of that significant price sensitivity without a good supply regulation then doesn't really incentivize industry to deliver innovative products and models to the consumer that they can pick. I mean, MG Comet has just come up right recently, and it's done some wonders in the market. It reminds me of what Reva was 15 years ago or 14 years ago, and that was a bit too early in the day. Limited range, whatever, all of that, very early technology is fair, but it did something, right? It created a momentum in India. I think the Comet is coming in at a time when technology is far more advanced. It's got I think it's got an 18 kilowatt hour battery pack. It claims it's had a 200 odd kilometer range. Even if it's 150 kilometers, I think that's great for a vehicle of that size. And it's that small compact urban vehicle, and it's selling more volumes, if I'm not mistaken, than its MG ZS EV counterpart, which is also 3 times more expensive. But it's found a niche in the space, and there are buyers who are ready to do that. So I think we need more of that kind of stuff, right? So how do you actually force the market to do some of that level of innovation and technology that, as we were talking earlier, can pivot consumers to start buying and doing, right? I don't think consumers are averse as long as it meets their requirements and needs. It's about giving them confidence that the technology works, it does, and it delivers, and it serves their mobility needs and whatever else. So yeah, I wouldn't blame it. I don't think we should be blaming the lack of consumers, or rather, we should not be using consumer attitude as the excuse to not sell more EVs and whatever. I think it's a two-way game. And then, of course, parallelly, I think we still need to invest a fair amount in raising a lot more consumer awareness. I think we create, sometimes there is a narrative that gets created and then it kind of stays around. So I think there needs to be that effort, no doubt. But I think I'm slowly becoming a proponent of the fact that a regulatory push, and like a concerted, enforceable regulatory push on the supply side, will automatically bring consumers closer to that market transformation. So take cars, for example. I mean, we're at less than 2% new sales share right now. I mean, you're telling me that there are at least 10% or at least even 5% of Indian car buyers are hesitant to buy an EV? Of course not. I mean, it's about being able to create some solutions and models and whatever, market products that they're excited. I mean, you walk into a showroom. I'll give you another good example. I've walked into showrooms just as curiosity for vehicle manufacturers who sell EVs as well in India. The dealership staff sells me the IC engine vehicle and not the EV, even if I go asking for an EV. And there is a level of perverse, incentive mechanism, right? For example, right. The dealership staff gets very often, the way this works is, you get a certain fixed pay, and then a significant part of a thing is linked to your sales targets and whatever else. Now, how the time and effort that I would put in to make a pitch to a consumer to buy an EV, and the probability that they would buy an EV. So for every 10 customers that walk into my dealership, the probability of somebody buying an EV is far lower than the probability of somebody buying an IC engine vehicle today, right?
Right, right,
But because my incentive structure for my salary is so linked to sales targets, that I also then get trapped in that thing and end up selling whatever
yeah.
is the more obvious thing. But and so maybe there is also a way to figure out how these incentive mechanisms, not at the consumer side, but actually at this midpoint, which is not the manufacturer, not the consumer, but the midpoint dealership ecosystem. How do you tweak, incentives for dealership staff to be able to sell, or at least make a fairly equal pitch to consumers about buying an EV, right? I mean, there is nothing that stops us from rethinking some of that, right? So I agree with you. I mean, there will always be consumers who are hesitant. I mean, it's not like
Mm.
Europe is at 50% sales. I mean, Europe also is on an average, I mean, at least Western Europe, about 15-16% new EV sales this past year. Um, but we are not even there yet. So obviously we can get there, right? We're at 2%. So can we get to 8 or 9%? I'm sure with some level of all the things we just discussed. I mean, we should be able to capture that part of the market. Then it'll slow down. So then you need to find another next level of trigger for consumers and whatever else. And also by then, technology will also improve. I think now we've
Right.
come to 5 years ago, where we were with technology versus today is different. And I think now there is generally a far greater confidence in EV technology being able to deliver what's required, right? So yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of onus on both public institutions, whether it's national or subnational governments, as well as industry, to equally create that level of communication strategy and awareness for people to be more confident. And there can be different ways. I mean, for example, three-wheelers, I'm talking autos, not rickshaws, but autos, I remember in those days, we launched the Mahindra Trio or three-wheeler, and similarly, there were other, players also in the market like Kinetic and others. But like, the way auto drivers not easy to convince. I mean, and they're all auto unions, and they have. So what you would do to help them build confidence was we used to run, drive clinics for them. So we used to have them come in, spend a day, test, have a few test vehicles in some big area, open area, and then they would drive and get, so helps build confidence in doing so. For depending on who the consumer is and which kind of vehicle segment and use case you're talking about, there are ways in which you can build confidence and pivot consumer attitudes. Yeah, I mean, we briefly talked about Aether. I mean, on the vehicle side, there are others. There's Alti Green, and and I think there are numerous number of startups that are doing different things. I mean, there are charging players. Startups bring a level of agility in the ecosystem that sometimes legacy players don't kind of struggle to go through. Okay, let's and there is a reason why, in general, the startup ecosystem been able to kind of thrive and succeed. I think at least in from whatever I've been following, I mean, I think there is also more and more. So like, I mean, startups are also finding when legacy players figure out that sometimes it's hard for them to ramp up the way startups are doing things and the level of agility, they end up investing, right? So there is major players investing in Aether, in Ultraviolet,
Right.
or whatever, right? And so there is increasing dynamic between major industrial players in the ecosystem and the startup ecosystem to help kind of drive. But again, right? I think one of the things, for example, I mean, and it also sometimes gets constrained by policy or whatever, right? So there are so many startups I'm aware of, for example, who do low cost, retrofits for older IC engine 2 3 wheelers, or even sometimes for, I think, cars and vans. Now, we don't really have a formal retrofit incentive policy or whatever. uh, there's no reason we shouldn't, right? I mean, that we can easily provide or create a space for things like these, and that these are good innovations. I mean, we keep talking about the fact that India is a price-sensitive market. We need affordable solutions, but then you have this ecosystem. I mean, this is a good example of that, right? You have this one ecosystem that's doing retrofits kits, EV retrofit kits that can help bridge that gap for a fair share of consumers, right? And India is a large market, right? So it's not like they're eating into somebody else's space. There is enough and more for everyone to coexist, in my opinion. And I think, and this could be we often default in our minds when we say vehicle electrification, we think urban markets. I mean, if you look at some of the, I mean, e-rickshaws, for example, I mean, they're more prominent in rural or peri-urban markets and as compared to urban markets, right? Delhi is an exception, but most other major metros have not really allowed e-rickshaws to kind of exist due to whatever regulatory requirements. But my point being that even in e-autos, I recall seeing a fairly equivalent momentum in tier two, tier three markets as opposed to big metro cities. So my point being that I think that we probably undermine the potential of so-called non-urban markets to adopt and to kind of move with this ecosystem. But this is where I think there is so much scope for a lot of what startups are doing in terms of innovation and low cost solutions and whatever else, to drive even market transformation in areas where we don't conventionally think as the default setting, right? I mean, this is just one example. I mean, but then you also have startups getting into, for example, battery technology. And so I mean, there is Log9, which is a startup that does which is doing innovations in batteries and stuff like that. And I think even there is so much scope for application and across ecosystems and whatnot. So without a doubt, I think the startup ecosystem has a strong role to play. But I think it still goes back to my point of, if we had a good, clear regulatory ecosystem that pushes and says, okay, this is exactly what needs to be done, you will only enable this ecosystem to do more and be able to, because having all of that means that you will de-risk the market's uncertainty and other parameters that startups often operate under, and helps them raise more capital at lower cost, etc. Otherwise it's a struggle, right? It's not the easiest case to make. I mean, it's a tough world as it is being a startup. So I think being able to have that level of policy and regulatory certainty helps startups also kind of thrive and go beyond what they currently are able to achieve. Where I would like to see is, I think in the 2035 scenario, since now we're almost turning the 5-year mark on this decade, but I think in around the 2035 mark, India has the capability to get to, let's say, and I'm saying, good quality transition. So we're not talking cheap stuff, but we're talking regulated, good quality models, even if they're low cost solutions, no problem. But let's say two-wheelers, I think new sales easily we could be doing 35% or so. In cars, we could be doing 15-16%. In three-wheelers, I think we should actually be able to do way more than 50-60%. It's not a difficult segment to move. I think that's one segment in three-wheelers where we've actually seen a lot of, we've really seen, like, now things move from TCO parity to like price parity, right? So there is scope to, I think, do. And three-wheelers, actually often we default think about three-wheeler passengers, but three-wheeler cargo is another major segment where we're already seeing huge demand. And Amazons and others who are deploying and procuring and deploying as part of their commitments in India, and there are similarly other fleet players who are doing it. So I think that's the space where, in my mind, there is actually a lot of scope to run with it. The one space that I think right now there is a limited traction is what I would call as your urban short haul or medium haul vans and delivery vehicles and things like that, which I think are another low-hanging opportunity. I mean, it's the same logic like fleet electrification. There is and there is capability to deliver, but I don't think we've been able to tweak around policy around that yet. So, but I think that could be another space where, in my mind, we could reach easily 10-12% by 2035. And then buses, of course, I wouldn't hazard a guess, but I think there we would likely see strong momentum, and that's been a good story for us. So yeah. But for all this to happen, I think I think we are now at that inflection point for India where we need where we can and we should take more clear, definitive policy actions that can drive this market change, both regulating the IC engine ecosystem and kind of pushing the EV supply side requirements, etc. And then, of course, you can align the incentive mechanism, etc., to meet all of that. The reason I also say this is, India being now a major automotive manufacturer and player in the global ecosystem, we should remember that our competitors are also doing all of this. So the more we delay, it's not only about domestic market transformation, but you will also potentially risk losing competitive advantage in international markets, because as other markets where you are exporting to start moving faster than you, and if you're not producing because you have not created a domestic ecosystem for it, then you are risking that gap to be filled by others. And especially in global trade ecosystems, once there is a structural shift, it's very hard to undo that structural shift. And I think if not for anything else, industrial policy and industrial competitiveness, which is now so central to any policy decisions we take in India, whether it's PLI, everything has an industrial policy context on the EV side. But I think just for that reason, should be a strong motivator for India to actually, be able to deliver on some of this. So hopefully, we'll find, in my mind, it's not, I don't mind what the motivation is to do it, as long as we can do it. And that's fine, right? I mean, it's every country to each his own. And if India feels that industrial policy and investment is a good motivation for us to do this and build our capability and create a strong domestic market that then, gives us that game to continue to play and be strategic in global automotive value chains, then so be it, right? And that's the way to go.